Good morning. The committee will come to order. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our Committee on Small Business hearing on the Export Control Reform Initiative, the ECRI. This is part of our hearing series on the ECRI. Yesterday, the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade held a hearing where members heard directly from small businesses and trade compliance specialists on their firsthand experiences with the new export control system. I'll mention we heard some good things about the current status of the ECRI, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we heard some bad things. And now that we have identified some of the challenges America's small businesses face when navigating the export control system, I hope we can take the opportunity that this hearing presents to address some of these concerns and figure out just how the administration plans to better assist small businesses engaged in trade. As a longtime member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and current chair of the Committee on Small Business, international trade has continued to be one of the topics that I'm very passionate about. And I will also note that I understand the importance of the United States export control system and the underlying implications for our national security goals, foreign relations, and economic growth. Defense materials and products and services that serve a civilian and military purpose, also known as dual-use items, should undoubtedly be scrutinized when they are leaving the country and being sold to a foreign buyer. However, small businesses should not carry the burden of navigating a complex export control system, and since the administration has moved to implement the ECRI, it looks like they agree. As I mentioned, we heard yesterday from some small businesses directly engaged in the export control system. They all agreed that while the goal of improving the export control system is a good one, government agencies are asking too much of the exporters, particularly small business exporters. These businesses are often discouraged from exporting due to their limited time and resources that can't be redirected to navigating the complexities of the export control system. I recognize that generally the ECRI has been met with broad support from American businesses, and good or bad, change is hard. I believe there is a certain level of responsibility on the government to ensure that this transition doesn't overburden small businesses, and I'm concerned with the government's somewhat lackluster outreach efforts. Additionally, we have heard that the export control lists aren't completely synchronized, and that's creating some confusion. There are also valid concerns about the long delays in the agency's licensing approval processes and the cumbersome paperwork requirements. So clearly, much work still remains to be done. I think we all look forward to hearing from our administration witnesses about what progress the ECRI is making in the simplification of export controls, but I'm more interested in hearing about how the administration is alleviating pressures on small business exporters. I want to thank you again and thank everyone for being here today, and I would now like to yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this valuable hearing. With small and mid-sized firms accounting for 98% of U.S. exports, America's small businesses have a great stake in how our export licensing regulations function. Not only do small manufacturers stand to benefit as we improve this system, but entire regional economies rely on robust U.S. exports. In New York, for example, about 400 million tons of cargo moves through the city's port system, and volume is expected to increase 48% by 2040. Numbers like this make it clear that a well-run export licensing system is vital to sustaining and creating good jobs, especially in places like Brooklyn and New York City, where local ports generate significant economic activity. There is a long history of restricting certain types of products for export from the United States, specifically those related to defense or items that have both military and civilian uses. We all understand the importance of these regulations. It is vital to our national security and diplomatic relations that appropriate export control mechanisms are in place. At the same time, this system has become increasingly cumbersome. As we have seen in many other instances, when federal requirements become overly complex, small firms suffer the most. Often, they do not have the same resources the larger competitors utilize to navigate these processes. These concerns were on one driving force behind the administration's interagency review of the U.S. export control system. These changes are welcome, and so far we have heard positive feedback from the small business community. The 2010 reforms are an important example of the administration's working to reduce regulatory burdens on the private sector. It is clear from small business survey data that this review and these reforms are necessary. Fully 3/4 of businesses report time-consuming difficulties when trying to work with our export control system. More than half noted problems from dealing with multiple regulatory agencies. This should be no surprise. 7 departments share jurisdiction over the export control process. Add to this a responsibility of companies to know exactly what components in their products are regulated by which department, and you have a recipe for a serious bureaucratic maze. These hurdles create challenges for even the most experienced, sophisticated exporters. For a small manufacturer who is looking to enter foreign markets for the first time, these difficulties may seem insurmountable. I am particularly concerned that if our export control is not fully modernized, we will hinder growth among firms that show the greatest promise for innovation. We have heard entrepreneurs that manufacture wind turbines, solar panels, and energy efficiency devices are losing opportunities to foreign competitors due to our export licensing procedures. Similar problems are reported in other high technology and rapid growth sectors. This is distressing, as these are the very same industries we are counting on for job creation in coming years. In a few weeks, this committee will visit New York for a field hearing where we will hear from local manufacturers. During that session, I intend to ask our witnesses about their experience with U.S. export licensing controls. Mr. Chairman, I think all of us share the goal of ensuring our export licensing procedures function effectively, protecting our diplomatic and national security interests, while also ensuring U.S. small businesses are not needlessly burdened. I believe this goal is something we can achieve by working together. In that regard, I thank our witnesses for being here and offering their insight. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. And if committee members have opening statements, I'd ask that they be submitted for the record. And I'll take just a moment to explain our lighting system for our witnesses. You're probably familiar with it, but we basically operate under the 5-minute rule here, and there's a lighting system to help you in that. The green light will be on for 4 minutes. The yellow light will come on to let you know you have about a minute to wrap up, and the red light, we'd ask you to complete your testimony by that time. If at all possible, we'll give you a little flexibility, but we'd ask you not to abuse the process. And we operate under the same rules ourselves, so we limit ourselves to 5 minutes as well. And I'd now like to introduce the a panel today, which is sometimes 4 witnesses. Today, only 2. Our first witness is the Honorable Kevin Wolf, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Export Administration at the Department of Commerce. Mr. Wolf was sworn in on February of 2010 and assists and advises the Undersecretary on the development of policies pertaining to export administration issues. And we thank you for being here. And our other witness today is the Honorable Brian Nilsson, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense Trade Controls at the State Department. Mr. Nilsson was appointed to this position on October of 2015 and provides overall policy guidance regarding the transfer of defense technologies to other countries. And we thank you very much for being here. And Mr. Wolf, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman Chabot and Ranking Member Velasquez. The purpose of export controls is to put a regulatory net over the export, re-export, and transfer of particular items, software, and technology to various destinations, end uses, and end users for a wide variety of foreign policy and national security reasons. And so if the exporters and re-exporters don't understand these rules and how to comply with them, then the national security and foreign policy objectives of the controls aren't met. So I want to thank you, this committee, and the members for having hearings like this and helping bring attention to the topic to help us get the word out to enhance overall compliance. So thank you for that. So as with most areas of regulations, export controls are inherently complex. There are different items of different sensitivities. Countries are of different levels of concerns. End uses and end users are of different concerns. Foreign policies and national security priorities change over time. Technologies evolve. What was once very advanced and sophisticated and spooky becomes quite widespread and commercial. Slightly different fact patterns and particular capabilities of an item can have very different outcomes. The rules that exist today are the result of decades of legislation and regulatory decisions made by hundreds of individuals that fit into a multilateral export control regime system of like-minded countries that try to align their controls, all in a system that tries to take into account the various equities of the law enforcement side, the exporter and economic security side, national security folks, et cetera. And all of these equities are all pulled in together to make what is inherently a complex system. So in the extreme, there are two ways in which to have a radically more simple system. You can have a system that imposes controls on everything equally everywhere all the time. Therefore, there's not much analysis required in terms of what requires a license where to what destination, or a system that doesn't require a license anywhere, anytime, except when a company is specifically told about it. The former, of course, would impose a massive regulatory burden on U.S. companies and require a tremendously larger U.S. export control system to be able to accommodate that one. And the latter, of course, doesn't satisfy the national security or foreign policy objectives of why the controls exist in the first place. So what this administration has tried to do since the President announced the Export Control Reform Initiative in 2009 and then is better laid out by Secretary of Defense Gates in early part of 2010 is to modernize and update the system, an effort that really had been tried and announced several times over the decades but never really accomplished. In order to take into account different levels of sensitivity for different countries of concern in order to increase interoperability with our NATO and other close allies. And the hearing yesterday was an example, by the way, of all the points that I just described. You had a manufacturer that was saying, please don't control my item on the ITAR. Please allow me to have the regulatory flexibility of the Commerce Department regulations so I can stay competitive with my non-U.S. counterparts in this area and have fewer regulatory burdens. And then a freight forwarder saying it would be much easier if everything required a license everywhere and there weren't country-specific designations or differences and all items were treated equally all the time. And so your panel yesterday was a good description of the inherent tension of export controls. So one of the things that we've done as part of the reform effort is to take into account the realities of the rules that have been in place for the couple of years. So these are two pivot blocks. I heard the members like props, so I brought props that we've been using for a long time, but these two actually summarize this entire massive multi-year export control reform effort really quite well. All they do is hold brake assemblies together on large vehicles. One of these was developed, specifically modified for a military vehicle, and the other one was developed for a dump truck. They both serve exactly the same function, have exactly the same basic holes. The only difference is that this one is for metric because the Marines like a metric system and the dump truck people like a standard dimension. Under the old system, prior to the reform effort, it was simple. This required a license everywhere all the time as a statutory requirement under the regulations of my friend over here. And if a French company were to buy this and install it into a fire truck, then that French company making fire trucks would forever need a license from his department as a statutory requirement everywhere that fire truck was exported. And so what that did is it created a disincentive under the old regulatory system, although it was simple to apply, for non-U.S. companies to buy relatively simple items, largely made by small and medium-sized companies, because of the regulatory burden that would go along with something having once been originally modified for a military application that has now found its way into widespread commercial applications. This one, designed for the dump truck, could be exported worldwide without any requirements except for the embargoed countries. So what we've done with the reform effort, and I have literally hundreds of thousands of examples I could have brought with me today, is to take items that are less sensitive and to no longer regulate them on the State Department list, but to move them over to the Commerce list so that they are relatively similar in control, so that you don't have this regulatory burden that I was describing that creates a disincentive for non-U.S. companies to buy U.S. origin items for less sensitive military or for commercial applications. Now, the upside of that is that there can be fewer regulatory burdens. The downside of that, as described yesterday, is now people have to go through and decide, am I exporting a pivot block or a seeker for a missile, and everything in between. So that's where education and outreach and training is so critical. Now, the controls still exist for these items as military items to embargoed countries and for bad end uses and bad end users, which also adds to the level of burden. In that sense now, if a company is exporting this to France or England, the burden is less, but if it's to a country subject to an arms embargo or for bad end use, the burden is increased in making those determinations. So we have at BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security, an entire office that does nothing but education and outreach. We estimate that we were able to contact almost 100,000 individuals by one means or another. Last year, we conducted or held or participated in over 350 seminars. Kevin, the Assistant Secretary, answer every question that comes into BIS about the export control rules and the reform on a free conference call that anybody can dial into every Wednesday at 2:30. And this has been a terrific benefit for exporters in that they can get answers to their questions free and of benefit to everybody else who may be dialing in.
Mr. Wolf, I'm
yes.
have to cut you off.
Sure.
We'll get around to you in the questions.
Oh, I have just passed my 5-minute line there.
You did. You went
I
a little
did.
over the
I got
allotted
really
time,
excited there.
But you did bring. You went over the allotted time, but you brought such excellent props that we're going to forgive you.
I apologize. I was thinking I had 2 minutes left, so never mind. Thank you.
We'll get around to you in the questions. Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much. Mr. Wolf, or excuse me, Mr. Nelson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great, thanks very much. So good morning, all, and Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Velasquez and other members of the committee. Thanks very much for having the hearing with us today. I've been working on the Export Control Reform Initiative since its inception, very enthusiastic about it, and we very much appreciate. We wouldn't be where we are today as far down the path in doing reforms if it hadn't been with the help and assistance of a lot of people across the departments, across Congress. This committee helped us in partnering us with the Small Business Administration and others, and so I very much appreciate the help and support that we've gotten to get as far as we've gotten so far. So ECR is first and foremost, a national security review. It has 3 core objectives: better using our resources, improving interoperability with our allies, and bolstering the health and competitiveness of our industrial base, which includes the second and third tier suppliers, which are predominantly small and medium-sized businesses. The system that we've been operating under, the pre-ECR system, was based on a premise that we controlled, that the United States has exclusive ownership of all the technologies that we need for our industrial base, and that we actually procured enough to where we sustain our industrial base without the need for exports. And so that has changed. And so the reality is now is that we do joint development programs with our allies, and we don't procure enough, even among those, for the items that we do procure, to be able to really sustain the health of the industrial base, particularly at the second and third tiers of supply. And so what we need to do is we've been systematically going through a process so that we can make it easier for the small and medium-sized companies who constitute the second and third tiers of supply, so that they can actually do the aftermarket sales and support for the larger systems that we've already exported without the need for having to come in for individual licenses. The goal of that is to make sure that we maintain the health and competitiveness of our industrial base, and to keep that manufacturing in the United States so that they're there when we need them for current and for future national security needs. The cornerstone of the effort that Kevin has referenced is really looking at the Department of State's munitions list, the USML. The USML is comprised of 21 categories of items. Pre-ECR wasn't really a list per se. The categories list broadly what end items are in a given category. For example, Category 8 controls aircraft, helicopters, drones, and then within that category it also has very broad, non-specific catch-all language, and it said that we control anything that's specifically designed, adapted, modified, or configured for anything that's in this category. And so as a result of that, it's sweeping controls without prioritization, and so that results in not only would I control a fighter aircraft under my list, I would control every part, every nut, every bolt, every screw, the seat belt, the windshield wiper, the clips, all the things that I've now transferred over to Kevin without prioritization. And so that's like Lucy and Ethel in the chocolate factory where the things are coming out on the process line. And you don't prioritize, we are not able to prioritize those items that warrant the greater scrutiny because we're spending so much time on all the lower level items that, and the reality is that we need to control them, but we want to make them to be able to go more easily to our allies and make it easier for our small and medium-sized companies to be able to export. So what we've done is that in 2012, using my aircraft example, we did over 22,000 export licenses just in that one of 21 categories on the munitions list. And over 76% of those were for these unenumerated, unspecified items that are caught by this specifically designed, adapted, modified, or configured for anything above. And so as a result of that, we've taken through a 6-year painstaking interagency process led by the Department of Defense, where we've actually opened every category, looked at what is inside each of these categories that provides the United States with the critical military or intelligence advantage. And if it doesn't meet that standard, we should move it over to Kevin's list to make it more flexible under more flexible authorities. And so based on aircraft alone, last year our licensing dropped to about 6,800 licenses, which is about a 70% drop from what we've seen pre-ECR. And for that unenumerated list of unenumerated, specifically designed, adapted, modified, or configured for military application, we now have a relatively short list of specific items that should be warrant controlled, and everything else is moved over to the commerce list. So we've seen an 83% reduction in licensing for the items that are like this that are made that are now moved over to Kevin's jurisdiction. Where we are in the effort now, we have completed the work on 18 of the 20, or we've published proposed rules for 18 of the 21 categories on the list. Of those 18, we've published final rules for 15 categories, and so those have gone into effect. And we're doing this through a series of proposed and then final rulemaking so that the public has an opportunity to provide input, which has been instrumental in the work that we've been doing. That leaves me with 6 more categories on my list. So 3 of those categories we've published in proposed form. For Category 12, which is night vision and thermal imaging cameras, Category 14, toxicological agents, and then Category 18 for directed energy weapons. Category 12 and 14 are among the most difficult we've had. We've had interagency struggles on what the right controls have been for probably 15 to 20 years. And so we've actually working through those, are working through those now. Based on the public input on Category 12, we're in the process of going out for a second pair of proposed rules because we didn't quite get it right based on the industry's input. So we're redoing and moving forward with those now. So the prioritization now is to get Category 12 out again. We're then working toward doing final rules for 14 and 18 for directed energy weapons and for toxicological agents. And then that leaves us my final 3 categories, which are firearms, big guns, and ammunition. Those are next in the priorities, and we're turning to those next as we get these others out the door. And so we're committed to proceeding with finalizing our initial review of the entire USML by the end of this year. So we're going to look at finishing or looking at having proposed rules for all 6 categories by the end of this year. Other things I could talk about very briefly, we can talk about our IT infrastructure. Happy to answer questions about that. Outreach and partnership, as I said at the outstart, we would not have done this and not have gotten this far if it hadn't been for the instrumental input that we've gotten from everyone involved. Pre-ECR, the State Department didn't do proposed rules. We claimed a foreign policy exemption. We were in charge, and we published rules, and then the rules were the rules. And so now what we do is we do proposed rulemakings. We do dialogue with industry, with our partners, with our allies, with the Congress. If we don't get it right, we put it out again for another proposed rulemaking. And so just this past year, we've participated in over 700 events where we do training and outreach. We have a dedicated team that's just answering questions from industry. We've done about 19,000 phone calls last year to answer questions. We did over 22,000 emails where we're answering and following up. We also have everything that we do, facts, Q's, and A's. We actually have decision trees to help exporters walk through the regulations that we have on our website, on Kevin's website. The administration has a single website where all the departments who are participants in this put everything there, including our proposed rules, all the public comments that we receive, so it's very transparent. industry can sign up for that, and they can get e-notices so they can know what's happening and when. So,
Thank you. I think we'll get to the rest of
Okay.
your testimony maybe through the question process.
Okay,
if that's
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony, and we're giving Mr. Wolf credit for his excellent props, and we'll give you credit for an I Love Lucy reference. I think that's the first time since I've been chair. That's a great episode if you haven't seen it, by the way, when Ethel and Lucy are trying to take care of the chocolate machine. It's a classic. So we, of course, this is a small business committee, so most of our concerns are with reference to small business, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to get into some of those. My first question would be, and this would probably be more directed to you, Mr. Wolf. Most industry experts seem to agree that export controls disproportionately impact small business folks. What effort is the administration making to help narrow the gap between larger and small business when it comes to navigating the export control system?
Sure, there are two ways to approach that. One is from the structural regulatory changes we're making, and second, from the length and the type of outreach that we do. On the structural changes, it goes back to my pivot blocks. I mean, small and medium-sized companies, prior to the reform effort, if they were the maker of one of these types of items to export, as a military item, they would have been required to register with the State Department. They would have been required to pay fees. They would be required to get purchase orders before every individual shipment. The foreign parties that bought these would be forever required to get permission from the State Department, even when they were incorporated into commercial or other items for allied countries. They would have required these very lengthy manufacturing license agreements and technical assistance agreements in order to be able to transfer data or to do services overseas. They would have required permission to perform services on these items. There are requirements on importing these items back into the United States. There were precious few license exceptions available to be able to transfer these and related items and technology for repair or for government end users or for NATO countries. Under the reform effort, all of those burdens, all of that massive regulatory structure that I've just described, which is massive, trust me, for items that have moved over to our commerce list after the 6 years of work that Brian was just describing, have disappeared. So from the regulatory structural perspective, we have made massive changes to the requirements for trade with largely NATO and other friendly countries that has radically reduced the overall regulatory burden for primarily small and medium-sized countries. So that's baked into the system. So when you bring about a change like that, whenever you go from something that forever before that this required a license everywhere all the time and the small company never had to think about what country, what end use, what it was going into, just get a license for everything, that raises all the difficulties and the burdens that you described, or the panel rather, and you described in your testimony yesterday and today. And that's where our education and outreach efforts come in, and every available resource that we have in an entire office that's dedicated nothing other than to conduct panels, to go out and visit companies, to do online training resources, everything that we can think about to solve that. Once the changes get baked in, then it becomes easier.
Thank you. As I had mentioned before, and as you're aware, we had a subcommittee, one of our subcommittee hearings met yesterday, and we had some small business folks commenting and giving us their experience on this. And in the testimony that the subcommittee received yesterday, we heard that some clients struggle with missing, incomplete, or contradictory definitions of underlying export principles. What effort is the administration making to try to address these issues? And either one of you are welcome to answer the question. You're
going to love what we're going to publish here in the next couple of months, because we have been, over the last couple of years, working on a large rule to largely harmonize all of the underlying and structural definitions between my set of regulations and his set of regulations. And the final rule will be out in the next few months, and we've been making changes in that regard. The two sets of regs evolved differently in different orbits for the last 40, 50 years, and they're Latin and Greek. And so I completely acknowledge and agree with everything that was said yesterday about the difficulties in comparing between the two sets of regs. But in about 2 or 3 months, you're going to see a very large regulation that's going to take the same words, the same phrases, and largely the same structures between his regs and my regs, and to the extent that they weren't being made the same, will be made the same. And this all leads to the ultimate objective, which neither Brian nor I got into. Actually, why don't you do the ultimate objective, since I've been talking so much about where we're leading?
Yeah, so the ultimate objective of this is that by all the work that we're doing is a prerequisite, because a prerequisite to the eventual nirvana in export controls, where our agencies would merge and we would have a single export control agency that has a single export control list. I mean, actually, in the early days of ECR, at the request of Representatives Berman and Ross Layton, the GAO did an assessment and did a comparison of our five closest allies for how are their export control systems structured, and how did it compare with our vision of, you know, a single licensing agency, a single control list, a single primary enforcement agency, and a single IT system to rule them all. And the answer is that everyone else in our closest trading partners, the British, the Canadians, the Japanese, the Swedes, and the
Other friendly countries.
some other, I forget, had all separately come to the same common sense conclusion. And so all of the work that we're doing is tailored toward that, because all of the stuff, while I gave him my pivot blocks, eventually we should be able, the way we've structurally done this, to merge the list together to where these will still be treated as less sensitive. It will be easier to export those for the items that are the most sensitive items that provide us with a critical military intelligence advantage. They would still be warranting the level of control that I'm required to do by statute under the Arms Export Control Act.
Thank you. Thank you. My time has expired. Ranking members recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we do a lot of hearings in this committee and focus on improving the climate for small businesses to really thrive. And I can say today that I like what I hear, but it sounds good. Execution, of course, is very important. And to that point, I would like to address my first question to both of you. While coordination and cooperation among agencies is a primary goal for improving the system, we heard some complaints from freight forwarders about the role CPB has in this process and how delays due to their own confusion hinders their companies. What kind of outreach and education are you doing for government employees to expedite approvals and, of course, to reduce confusion?
That was a terrific comment yesterday. We did at BIS a whole tour of several Customs and Border Protection offices over the course of last year. But there's always a great deal of turnover, and it's a very large agency. So that comment yesterday and your comment just now reminds us that we need to make sure to keep doing that over the course of this year and follow-on years. When you have any sort of change that's as massive as what we have done, you have to spend a lot of time educating not only the exporters but other parts of the U.S. government so that they're comfortable as well. Because people had, remember, the system had been baked in for about 40 or 50 years, and given the absence of a lot of definitions on key terms, exporters and government officials had largely made up their own rules. And so what we're trying to do is shake things up to get everybody on the same page. And your point is very well taken. I can give you the numbers later on the number of customs officials that we educated and trained last year. And sometime over the course of 2016, we'll be doing the same. But your comment is a reminder that we need to keep doing that on a very regular basis.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, the BIS requested $115 million for FY 2016, an increase of over $12 million over the fiscal year 2015 enacted level, and received $112.5 million. Is any of this additional funding spent on better assisting small business exporters in any way?
Well, not yet. It's only been about a month since the budget has come into being, and it's gotten us back to the level of giving us enough resources to be able to fill many unfilled positions, some of which were in our education and outreach office. So absolutely, a significant portion of that will be to education and outreach.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
And Mr. Wolf, yesterday's panel of private sector witnesses explained that many businesses that were under the ITAR system are now getting lost in the EAR system and experiencing significant complications. Are you doing anything to ease their transition to operating under a new system?
In two ways. Structurally, what we've done is that we have had significant grandfathering periods of several years for companies to get used to the new system before they were required to transfer over it. 2 and sometimes 4 years a company can have before they have to go into the new system. With every one of the rules we've, as Brian described, have done as proposed rules, asking for massive industry output, the weekly conference calls and the hundreds of seminars and conferences that we've supported as well in order to educate people. And so, yes, we have been doing it in two ways. One, structurally with significant delays in implementation and allowing people to transition over. And then second, education and outreach. And then third, just a complete recognition. And we asked companies about this at the beginning, where we said, if we are going to do this very large transition in the system, it's going to be very hard for several years. You're going to have to completely rethink everything that you got used to over the last 50 years and how export controls work. Is the long-term gain of the reduced regulatory burden and the simplified system worth the short-term pain in getting used to what those new rules are and getting off of old practices? And almost overwhelmingly, exporters said yes. So that's why we've done what we've done for the national security objectives that Brian laid out very well in his opening.
Thank you. Mr. Nielsen, in July 2013, the State Department successfully transferred its export licensee database and software platform to the one used by the Department of Defense. The Department of Commerce was scheduled to begin using it in early 2014. As a result, the three largest departments involved in export licensing are now on a single IT platform. Can you describe whether the creation of a single IT platform allowed the Department of State, Commerce, and Defense to more effectively administer the export control system?
And the gentlelady's time's expired, but you can answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I can report that it actually has, the transition took us longer than we'd anticipated. We actually did not fully transition, the Commerce, Department of Energy, and the other parts of the State Department didn't fully transition to U.S. exports until October of 2015. But the beauty of us all being on one system is that previously we were all on separate IT systems, and so I could never see what Kevin had approved for, and I could never see what Kevin denied, which is also even of more concern, and vice versa. And so now, by having everybody on the same IT system, we as have a whole of government can tell collectively what the U.S. government has approved and would not approve for export. The beauty also of us now have up on a single platform is that now we're able to turn our attention to creating a single portal so that exporters would only have to go to one place to be able to file a license application or any other of these types of authorizations or determinations that they seek from the government. And so that also, we actually had done some preliminary work on that in 2010, but then realized we needed to wait until we had everybody on the IT platform first. So we've returned to that work now. So we're in the early days, but it's ongoing. And the beauty of that will be particularly helpful for the small and medium-sized companies because as you go in through a single portal, it will guide you as you fill out your application for where you need to go. And so therefore, they don't have to figure out if they're filing at the wrong agency. We'll be able to sort that out electronically for them.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Hulskamp, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today and trying to get a very quick, up to speed understanding of export control reform. I know you've been working on this a long time and 5 or 6 years initiative of the administration. I appreciate the efforts. My question, though, is what is taking so long in categories 1, 2, and 3? And I see from your website or the government website, absolutely no efforts reported on that. So, and that would be the firearms, guns, and ammunition categories. I will note for those listening that you've completed the missiles portion, 4, explosives 5, satellites, nuclear, chem, bios made some progress as well, but for some reason categories 1, 2, and 3 been sitting out there for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I don't know who would answer that and explain what the reason is for the delay.
Sure, I own those categories, so I'll answer the question. Yeah, the prioritization of the categories was really based on the remarks from Secretary of Defense Gates when we did the rollout in April of 2010, where he said I've outlined the 3 objectives of the reform initiative, but the SecDef's view was that we needed to prioritize based on interoperability with allies. And so the categories that we've been doing have been based on those that provide the best benefit for interoperability with their key allies. And so And we've also been systematically working through those. And so we haven't come to categories 1, 2, and 3 yet. We've done some preliminary work on them, but we're committed to finalizing the initial review of all the categories this year.
Is there an interagency group that recommended you move forward on that?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's the same 7 departments that have been working on all of the categories, and so we've already done we've done work on all 21 categories from the outstart. So we're just not quite there yet for publishing proposed rules.
But exactly why are those categories not making progress, and when
Well-
will we make progress?
Well, we're committed to finishing the initial review and having those categories done this year. The primary reason is
Well, this year,
yes, in 2016.
well, this
We have an
administration's going to
obligation
run out
to
of time.
finish, Yes.
And again, there's absolutely no progress. I mean, you've got proposed rules in 2011, 5 years ago for like category 8, and it's glaring. I just don't understand why those 3 have absolutely no progress in terms of this sheet, even though there have been recommendations from the interagency group that you move forward. And when was that recommendation made?
We were working on rules in 2012, and so on all 21 categories. And so again, it's been a prioritization for those categories, sort of meeting the Secretary of Defense's priority for those that contribute to interoperability. In the firearms
And he hadn't been
category-
Secretary of Defense for a while now.
Yes.
But my question is, I still don't understand why these 3 categories do not have any progress on them.
Primarily because by prioritizing those that are key for interoperability with allies in our firearms category, that category warrants reform, just as all the other categories. But over 90% of what I control in that category are not being exported to governments or militaries, and so there's not an interoperability issue with regard to those. But that begs the question that they certainly warrant going through reform, just as all other sectors that warrant going through reforms. And so for the industries that have not benefited yet from reform, that's firearms, that's the large manufacturer of things like howitzers, it's people who do toxicological agents, do chemicals, and so we will finish the job.
Those are all in categories 1, 2, and 3?
Those are all in the categories that have not yet been deployed in finals. So
Okay, well, some of those are not 1, 2, and 3, obviously,
right.
but you
They're-
made a proposed rule on a number of those already. My question is categories 1, 2, and 3. When can I expect?
this year.
And this year,
This year.
this administration.
We will finish. We are going to finish the USML this year.
Why haven't the rules been almost approved all the way up the chain and proposed those?
They haven't been finalized yet, and so again,
Who hasn't signed off on them? I'm just trying to get
the 7 departments have not signed off on them for what the rules would propose. But we're committed to doing proposed rules on those categories as all other categories.
Well, there are firms that are waiting on this and been waiting on years trying to fix.
We agree.
And you were given, I think you were $10 million additional to finish some of these things in the current fiscal year. So are we going to get done in the current fiscal year, or are you talking about next fiscal year before we even get done? I mean, when you say current year,
Well, we need to go through, the way the process works is we do proposed rules, we digest the public comments on those to see what adjustments that we need to make, and then at that point, then we would draft final rules, and then we publish final rules.
Sure.
And then there's a delayed effective date to allow each affected industry to be able to have time to transition to the new rules. And so that's the process for every category. So that process will run for categories 1, 2, and 3, just as we're in the midst of on categories 12, 14, and 18.
The gentleman's time has expired.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I had a prop if that would help last longer.
We like props.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair would just note that there's considerable, I think, suspicion by many members, at least probably half the members on this committee, that this administration, because it's not particularly considered to be a friend of guns or ammo, that this is sort of a willful neglect on their part, at least. And the irony is because of this attitude towards and concern about the administration's attitude towards gun, there's been a boon in sales of guns and ammos during the administration. So I think that's probably the underlying sentiment of my colleagues questioning there. I would now like to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. see. Just trying to gather myself after that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wolf, in the 2014 budget, the Bureau of Industry and Security processed 30,953 export licenses applications. BIS approved 83% of the applications, returned 16% without action, and denied 1% of them. Can you tell us, can you take us inside the BIS review process and explain how you make a determination on each application and what industry and sector had the highest denial rate?
Sure. The way for items that are subject to the commerce regulations, and our volume is not quite doubled, but moved from 23,000 to about a little over 36,000 since the beginning of the reform effort for items that are no longer subject to their regulations. A company will submit an application. Well, first it will go through the analysis of determining whether their item is subject to our regulations and determining whether a license is required for that destination. So that's the first step, because under our regulations, the answer is it depends upon what country you're shipping to about whether a license is required. Then, if a license is required to that destination, the regulations say to the exporter, you can go through and see if one of our exceptions apply. If it's an export to a friendly country for a certain item, then you won't need a license if you follow these conditions. And so, for example, under license exception, strategic trade authorization, which is one of the hallmarks of the reform effort, there have been over 23,000 shipments of items where exporters have determined a license is not required, where prior to the reform effort a license was required. So let's say they get to the point where an exception is available, a license is required, they, through an electronic system, send in information about end use, end user destination, value, country, what the end use is going to be, and a description. We, Commerce, will go through that and determine if all the information is there and sufficient, and then we forward it out to the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Energy, for them then to further defer out to other parts of their agencies for review as to whether there's a national security or foreign policy issue with the approval, denial, or conditioning of that license. Within a set period, roughly 30 days, under an executive order, they will get their answers back into us. In most cases, all of the agencies agree, and we will send back an approval or a denial or an approval with conditions limiting what they had asked for initially. In those very rare cases where there's a disagreement, we have an escalation process up to the Assistant Secretary and beyond process within the government to resolve disputes among the agencies. Once the disputes are resolved, then electronically a document goes back saying you have permission to export to these end users for these end users. That's the essence of how the process works.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What was the denials? What's the largest sector?
So given that the largest volume of what we're dealing with now is in the aircraft and engines category, in absolute numbers, those tend to be among the higher either denial or RWA rates, just based on absolute numbers. We have, in terms of percentage denials, it would be in areas of night vision and optics, where there are significant limitations or conditions about how those commercial items would be used overseas that could be potentially used for a bad end use. So the answer depends if it's an absolute or a percentage-based number.
Okay. Well, you know, I appreciate your testimony today, and it's very refreshing to have an entity come before us and are really working to reduce the bureaucracy and meld together. And, you know, I wish you continued success in that effort.
Thank you.
The gentleman yield back? Okay, thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New York, Ms. Meng, who is the ranking member of the Agricultural, Energy, and Trade Subcommittee, who held the hearing yesterday, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member, Velasquez, and to our witnesses for being here and for the great presentations. I know that, Mr. Wolf, you spoke a little bit about education and outreach initiatives through BIS, and I'd love to hear some more. Mr. Nielsen, I'm wondering how you provide such assistance, specifically regarding the U.S. munitions list. How do you work with the SBA export assistant offices? And do you have staff in these offices who can assist potential small business exporter who has a USML classified technology product and has never exported before, and just how this process works?
Yeah, the State Department, we actually do not have staff that are in the SBA export centers. We do, in partnership with the Commerce Department, though, coordinate our regulations so that they are actually shared with the SBA and shared with the export assistance centers, and so they see the rules rather than having to just rely on seeing them in the Federal Register or relying on our websites. But we do have them on our websites. We do outreach and training. We actually work closely with a number of organizations around the country, particularly with the Society for International Affairs, which is a nonprofit organization which host tailored export control sessions around the countries on the U.S. munitions list. We also, I think I mentioned earlier, we have a number of decision tools and sort of guidelines so that if you can walk through a decision tree for how to engage our controls that we have on our website. We also have a dedicated team that does nothing but talk to people on the phone and answer questions. And so we do last year we did a little over 19,000 phone call counseling sessions with companies. We also answered a little over 22,000 emails of people coming in and asking questions. We also coordinate with the other 6 departments, and we have a single website that's an administration-wide website where everything that we do is in one spot. So it's sort of a one-stop shop that's intended to guide and help provide assistance to companies. And then we participate with our sister agencies, with regional organizations to do outreach and training. We did a little over 700 last year.
So a few other points. Prior to the reform effort, there were about a dozen different parts of the U.S. government that maintained lists of individuals and companies against which there were sanctions or prohibitions or limitations on dealing with. These came from different parts of Commerce, from State, from the Treasury Department, and elsewhere. And one of the early things that we did in the reform effort at the Commerce Department is that we took on the responsibility for consolidating all these various lists that are pumped out on a daily basis by the U.S. government of entities and persons against which there are some sort of sanctions or limitations. And we have consolidated that all into one list administered by Commerce that we make free and available in a downloadable format for exporters. So that has been a significant improvement for exporters. As I mentioned, the 300 different or so conferences that we did last year, an entire office that handled about 33,000 phone calls from exporters answering generally very basic questions about how the system works. We're redrafting parts of the regulations and the definitions, as Brian mentioned, so that you don't have to do sort of the guesswork as to whether something is or isn't controlled. I was a practitioner in this area for a long time before joining the government, and it was as much lore as it was law. People couldn't actually believe the regulations in front of them because it was done by reputation or lore or black magic as opposed to actual bright line definitions. So in addition to defining the terms, we are defining them in such a way as that someone can go on to one of these decision tree tools that Brian and I are creating on our websites, go through and answer a series of questions, yes or no objective questions, and always get to the right answer as a matter of law, and thus not need expensive outside counsel to be able to go through and make those determinations. So as I said, education and outreach is absolutely vital to what we do, not just for the sake of the small companies, but for the mission itself, because if they can't understand and comply, then the national security and foreign policy objectives aren't met. Any other ideas or suggestions or attention that this committee could help us bring to that effort or suggestions, we're all ears, and we're thrilled that you're engaged in participating and helping us on this.
Thank you so much. And I know I'm just about out of time, but I just wanted to ask my last question. Sure. Lastly, just a note on the commercial relationship with our closest ally, Israel. In December of 2014, President Obama signed into law the U.S.-Israel Strategic Partnership Act of 2014, which provides in part that the administration shall take steps so that Israel may be included on the Strategic Trade Authorization 1 list. If I could request that you advise me in writing what steps have been taken as required by the law and what more needs to be done in order to fulfill this requirement. And thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and we'd ask that the panel comply with the gentlelady's request. Thank you. And we'll move into a second round now. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. We heard from one of our small business witnesses at the subcommittee hearing yesterday that delays at the Directorate Defense Trade Controls sometimes lasted over 90 days, and that classifications were occasionally kicked back between the DDTC and BIS, resulting in further licensing delays up to 3 weeks. What's the explanation for this delay, and what effort is being made to address these concerns? Mr. Nelson.
Sure, that's a good question, so thank you. We have a process called the Commodity Jurisdiction Determination Process. That's where exporters can come into us and ask whether or not I have jurisdiction for the item, or does Kevin have jurisdiction for the item. And that's a process that's been in place a long time. When President Clinton did a reform initiative, he issued new directives to how to improve the process because of the vagueness and the lack of specificity in the munitions list. It became increasingly difficult for companies to know whether or not their items were subject to our list. And so, and then we actually, and President Bush in his reform initiative also issued new guidelines for how to run that process at the end of his administration. So where we are now is we actually anticipated that we would have a surge of such requests as a result of the changes that we're making, just based on companies wanting the comfort of having something from the government to tell them whether or not their item is subject to my list. We actually had the most number of commodity jurisdiction determination requests we've ever had in 2012. We did 1,367 CJ requests that we processed. Surprisingly, the numbers that are coming in, we expected spikes, and by category as we've deployed new categories so that people would have questions. Like when aircraft first went live, we anticipated getting a lot of commodity jurisdiction requests, and we have not had that. We've actually had a relatively steady decline in the number of CJ requests as a result of ECR. So last year we were down to slightly over 1,000. So we've seen about a 13% decline, and we attribute that because we've taken out that language that I mentioned earlier, where it says an item is specifically designed, adapted, modified, or configured for anything above, and now it's an enumerated list. And so, so my list is working as intended as we're transitioning, and so. We will always process CJs if someone asks for one, if they want that clarity and they want that piece of paper to say that, yes, it falls into Category 8H of the ITAR or not. So, so in that regard, we think the system is working as intended, and we're not having the spike that we thought we would have. With regard to license applications, companies have a history of coming into to the State Department and asking for authorization where they may not specify in great detail what's on that license application, because of the vagueness of my own list pre-ECR. Now they do have the challenge of knowing more specifically about what they're requesting on an export license application. In some cases, we will return that application without action if it's not my jurisdiction. And in each category, similar to what I mentioned on CJs, in each category as they've gone live, we've had a spike in return without actions, with people coming in just for clarification, because again, they wanted a piece of paper from us coming back to say it's no longer our jurisdiction to go see the Commerce Department, so that provides them the comfort level and it provides them the piece of paper so that if the customs agent stops them at the border, they have a piece of paper for me to be able to answer that question.
Thank you. Let me cut you off there because I've only got about a little over a minute left. I want to get to one more question. This one is for you, Mr. Wolf. Among a broad spectrum of businesses, particularly amongst small businesses, the staff that they can devote trade compliance issues and programs, oftentimes it's just not what they would probably like to do because they have so many other things that they're getting hit with. Does the administration take this kind of reality of the situation out there in the small business world into consideration when you're working with these programs?
Oh, absolutely. For the two reasons ways in which I described earlier, in terms of the structure of what we're doing and in the reduction of the burden of items that move, and our philosophy and mindset and the resources that we devote to education and outreach. I mean, personally, I do every day because that's where I came from. I was a counselor to large and small companies for 17 years before joining the government, and know very, very well the difficulties they have and had in complying with these regulations. And every day I bring that experience into trying to make the system more understandable for them. We have not actually completed by any means, but we've moved a dramatic way in that regard. I mean, think about this little company that makes the pivot blocks. Think about all those documents that I described that used to be required and all those regulatory requirements that used to exist in order to trade in these items prior to the system. Those largely no longer exist for the vast majority of trade. The number of times I talk with a small and medium-sized company where they go from having to have a compliance staff to administer 100 MLAs and TAs, these large complex agreements under their system, down to a very small number of pieces of paper under our system is dramatic. I hear it everywhere I go. So we can always find situations of individual companies where something isn't working or isn't clear, or they have a 3-month delay on a classification request or a license. But in the aggregate, the data is such that the overall regulatory burden structurally is gradually and dramatically reducing.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Nielsen, ITAR license application must be reviewed within a 60 days time frame. On average, how long does it take for this application to be reviewed?
Sure. That requirement comes as part of President Bush's export control reform initiative, where he issued a directive, NSPD 56 in 2008, that required me to process a license within 60 days. Our processing times have actually gone up as a result of ECR. I would say the last full year before we started making changes to the list, we did close to 90,000 licenses, and our average processing time was 19 days. So last year we did about 44,600 licenses, so it was almost half of what we've been doing previously, because I've given all the easy cases to Kevin, and our processing times have gone up to 27 days. And the reason being is because the pivot block cases were easy, and so these are easy cases to process, and so it actually helped me keep my average processing times quite low. But when I gave Kevin all the easy cases, that leaves me with the hard cases. Anyway, yeah, I'm not taking jurisdiction back. And so as a result, that actually is sort of the whole point, was that the items that are left on my list are the most sensitive items, and so we want our licensing officers within state and with the Department of Defense to have the time to really look at these cases that warrant the level of control. That's the higher wall around a smaller yard that Secretary Gates often spoke of.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, there is evidence to suggest that many foreign companies actually avoid U.S. companies when searching for products due to the increasingly strict export regulations. Foreign customers will often buy a more expensive non-U.S. source part just to avoid our export control system. This is particularly true when the international traffic in arms regulations apply. Mr. Wolf, at a time when we are trying to increase American manufacturing, are there other reforms or actions that can be taken to ease the burden on competition?
Well, what you described in your question is the essence of what I've been living for the last 6 years. It's the ITAR free movement. The Defense Department did a terrific job several years ago describing the harm to the U.S. satellite industrial base that resulted by ITAR controls, as required by statute, by the way, for all commercial satellite spacecraft and related items. And that created the very situation you've described of a disincentive for non-U.S. companies to avoid U.S. origin content for the very reason that you described. And fortunately, working with Congress on a bipartisan basis, we were able to get those controls removed and allow for more tailored control for our satellite and space industrial items. So to answer your question about what next, because what you described, again, is the essence of why we're doing what we're doing for the less sensitive items to the countries that are not subject to embargoes, is to continue on finishing up, revising the remaining categories, fixing them over the years as technologies change, threats change, to correct mistakes that we've made, and eventually getting to the export nirvana of a single agency under a single list, which is something we won't be able to complete now, but all of the work that we've done these last 6 years are all the groundwork to get to that point. So this is a multi-year effort to accomplish the very point that you're describing, again, never forgetting that these controls exist for a reason,
Right.
The national security and foreign policy reasons of there are some items to some end users, for some end users we don't want. So in getting to that point, you described the difficulty that was described on the panel. because under the old system, it was very easy for the practitioner, for the freight forwarder to know when a license was or wasn't required. But the downside is it has the negative effect that you very well described. The system thus, in tailoring it, creates more complexity, but eventually it will achieve the objectives that you just described.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Corbello, who's the chairman of the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade that held the subcommittee hearing yesterday on this issue, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. Thank you for this hearing, and I thank the ranking member as well. And yesterday we learned a lot from witnesses who have experience in dealing with all of these complex issues, including a small business owner from my district in South Florida. I wanted to ask, through your agency's collaboration with the SBA, do you consider the Office of International Trade staff to be trained well enough to address many of the questions small businesses have regarding the complex export control regulations? I want to focus in on this because it was a recurring theme yesterday where a lot of these people just couldn't find answers.
So we wouldn't expect the SBA to be an export control authority or expert in this. And in my testimony, it describes a great deal of outreach and interaction we've had with the SBA. And your question reminds me that we need to keep doing that over the course of 2016 to get to the point where anybody at SBA or any other small business organization knows enough at least to be able to refer it to state or commerce for us to then take it from there. It really wouldn't be practical to try to deputize effectively other agencies to come up to speed and become experts on this. I think the best that we can hope is that they are sensitized to the issues and the options and the resources that are available within the Departments of Commerce and State.
I think what at least I would request is that there be a special emphasis on small businesses. Again, the large corporations, they can figure this out. They can hire teams. They can hire consultants. It's the small businesses that really get left waiting for answers and sometimes never figure this out. So I think I'd probably speak for most members here on the committee and say if there could be a greater emphasis, focus, dedication of resources to helping referrals from the SBA, for example, that I think could make a big difference.
I agree, and any other ideas or suggestions or help in terms of visibility or people to talk to or companies to make sure in the loop, I look forward to working with you on that. I completely agree with everything you said.
So I'll add to that we have been partnered with SBA to make sure that they see the rules and the proposals and the final rules that come through. But one of the things that we can take back is that Kevin and I both have dedicated staff to do nothing but outreach and counseling and answering the phones. And so we can make sure that the folks at SBA know who to call on what. So we can certainly take that back and make sure that that's happening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back, and we want to thank our witnesses for their testimony here today. I think you've shed some light on an area that can be quite complicated, but nonetheless is extremely important, and particularly to the small business community. And that's obviously our principal responsibility is to make sure that we're looking out for the small businesses all across America who actually hire 70% of the new folks that come into this economy. So we appreciate your testimony. I would ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.